and welcome to another episode of Doubl3Tap. Today we are joined by John Radoff. John, hello sir, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, yeah. Excited to have you on. You were fairly early to Facebook and mobile gaming. I believe the previous company was sold to Tilting Point, right? Disruptor Beam, is that right?
Yeah, Disruptor Beam was my game studio. We built games based on Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Walking Dead, Archer. We actually made Beamable, my company now, which is a software infrastructure company for games, was actually born right out of Disruptor Beam. We sold the games to Tilting Point, but kept the technology that we were working on and turned it into a new business. But yes.
Nice. There we go. Very excited to be chatting about the web renaissance, along with some other topics. So yeah, without any further ado, we'll go straight into quick disclaimer time. The content in this episode is for educational and entertainment purposes only, should not be construed as financial advice. The opinions shared by Alex and I are our own, and we may have investments in the products or assets discussed throughout the show. So with that out of the way, John, what games are you currently playing?
Well, the biggest one I'm playing now is Baldur's Gate 3, which is such a great game. Really, it's probably close to my favorite game of all time, but I play so many different kinds of games that I'm just going to say it's in the top 3, as I'm not sure that games like Civilization, for example, just kind of have their own place in that. And I loved Mass Effect and Last of Us, but Baldur's Gate 3 is just such a great game. So I played a ton of that. I've finished the game twice. Now I'm playing through it with my son, and we're doing it in multiplayer, so that's a little bit different too. Other than that, played a lot of Darkest Dungeon 2 over the holidays, got into Dave the Diver, played Dredge, so those were fun. And then I'm super looking forward to a few more games this year. Like, it's a great time to just be a gamer and see the games coming out, because just as much as I love an RPG, love games with strategy elements as well. So I'm looking forward to Homeworld 3. Hades 2 is coming along. Love action RPGs. Was a huge Diablo player of pretty much all the Diablos. And there's a couple of Web3 games coming along that I'm excited about too, because I know we're going to talk Web3 here, but I think Wildcard, their game looks really amazing. And then Mystery Society is a really cool social deduction game that's built on our platform. So excited about all of those.
John, how has the characters or the classes that you picked for Baldur's Gate changed between each of the playthroughs?
Oh, interesting. So I've only played the 2 stock characters for my first 2 playthroughs. I'm now doing a light priest / monk in my new playthrough with my son, just because that's like super overpowered, and now I'm just ready to crush everywhere I go. But the first time I played through as Gale, I love mages. Like, that's kind of my go-to class if I'm a D&D player. The second playthrough, I played as the Dark Urge character, and I played him as a paladin, actually. So Dark Urge, he defaults to sorcerer, but you can do whatever you want with him. But I really liked the storyline around that, which is a little bit dark and kind of cool. So yeah, that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, I've got one playthrough that I'm doing a bard, just because I want to focus on like the conversational aspect. And then I've got one that's a little bit more straightforward, like, I'm just gonna smork it, right? Like big swords running straight at the enemy, and just gonna save Scummit if things don't work out. But big fan of Baldur's Gate as well.
I'm also second playthrough Paladin Dark Urge. First playthrough
nice.
was Sorlock,
there you go.
which was a lot of fun as well. So
yeah, well done.
Super.
I took a paladin base, and then I did warlock as well, because you can kind of stack the charisma bonuses and play it that way, and you can just do some really cool stuff.
Yeah, the sorcerer warlock build was like so overpowered, it gets kind of crazy.
Okay, cool. So yeah, let's get into it. So yeah, John, you've been writing a lot recently. Anybody that hasn't checked out John's Substack, please go take a look. But one of the topics that caught our attention was talking about kind of this attention economy, attention in games. So maybe if we could just kick it off. How do you think developers, studios, etc., in today's age of abundant content can do a better job of kind of capturing and then also retaining and kind of redirecting that attention, in your opinion?
So games have always been about attention. If you were going to a video game arcade back in the 70s or 80s, it was about attention then too. And the more attention you could grab on your machine, the more quarters someone's going to put into that machine and make you some money. So in some ways, nothing has really changed all that much from the video game arcade days in terms of how attention and money are kind of related to each other. We have far more business models now. So of course, there's Web3 stuff where it's going to be based on ownership, but there's also subscription play, premium games where you buy it and just enjoy it for as long as you want. There's free to play, all these different models, but they all share that same common thread of attention, which can be done a lot of different ways. So like Baldur's Gate 3, which we were talking about, well, the reason Baldur's Gate 3 was successful, other than the fact that they built a great game, and we can talk about that aspect in a moment of sort of what the funnel looks like for a game. It's because Baldur's Gate 2 was a great game, and Baldur's Gate 1 was a great game. So franchises have to deliver and retain attention as well. And it's kind of amazing that over this long period of time, that plus, of course, the cachet of Dungeons and Dragons was able to bring people into this game again, despite the fact that there was quite a gap in the time since the last one. So it doesn't have to be like all free to play, like grindy mechanics to drive the dollars out of attention. It can be over a longer period of time through franchises and titles. It can be Web3 through ownership mechanisms, which we're still, I think, trying to figure out like what is the best approach to that. But it's all comes down to attention. So, you look at the funnel for games, it's customer acquisition at the top, player acquisition at the top, through get them into the game, engage with them there, give them a lot of things to do, give them ways to replay the game, and then bring them back when you eventually either ship new content, which if you're a live ops game, maybe you're shipping content every week or every day, like Star Trek game that I started making almost a decade ago, which, as you noted earlier, run by Tilting Point today, like still shipping content like on a weekly, multi-time per week basis for that audience. So that's live ops. If you're not quite a live ops game, there actually are ways to incorporate some aspects of live ops, like events and tournaments and like content updates for your players that kind of keeps them coming back into the game regularly. So that's something you could consider, even if you're not like a free-to-play game. But if nothing else, you want to make sure that it's very memorable in their experience of the game so that they come back for DLC or the sequel or whatever you do next. So the thing that I think people miss in the funnel is how all the variables in the funnel, from the upper funnel metrics, kind of co-vary with the deeper funnel metrics. So the biggest mistake people have made that wasn't completely obvious going into like free-to-play gaming as it started to emerge a decade ago was everyone wanted to optimize around cheap cost of customer acquisition. But then a lot of people, to their peril, discovered that the lower the cost of your customer acquisition, the quality of the customers you're acquiring, quality in this sense, meaning people that are really interested in the kind of game you're making and would be willing to spend money on it, well, that also goes down, and then it affects your deeper funnel mechanics. So you're always you end up in this tail chasing scenario where like you're pumping in huge numbers of easy to acquire customers and then trying to figure out how to entertain them. And sometimes it's super hard. So I think you got to start with the engagement of your customers and focus on that above anything else. Engagement meaning how fun is the game? Like, is it genuinely fun? And you do that by really specializing in the kind of audience that you are concerned with, even more than the particular game, because the game can kind of move around a little bit. in terms of the features and things that are going to really delight that audience. But it starts with the audience first, knowing them. And if you're a game that can find, 1 or 2,000 of your ideal customer for the genre of game that you want to deliver to them, then it's a matter of figuring out how to scale that up later and attract more of those people. But you full stop must make the game an amazing experience for that audience that you're building for, or else you're just going to get lost in this sea of 14,000 games that shipped on Steam last year, and there's like I don't even know how many now apps on mobile, 2 million plus apps on mobile. Like, you will very easily get lost in that if you haven't genuinely focused on making the most delightful game that you can imagine for a particular target audience. And is it a high bar? Yes, the game industry is super hard. So if you've chosen to build here, that's what you're up against. And you can do it with the right team and the right product. And I think more importantly, continuous iteration is the craft that takes place in game making, where you're constantly getting feedback from your audience, incorporating it into the design, and really getting it great before you ship.
And are there any like major kind of red flags or things that you've seen in your career of game development where people are missing or over optimizing for in trying to kind of garner that attention? And I think here the assumption is that you have the potential to delight your user base with your product.
There's a lot of red flags that can emerge in games. I think it starts with team, and the team that builds a game is so important. Number one, they have to understand the audience, or at least several people on that team who are forming the core product direction and vision for it have to really understand what engages that audience. If you're building either a MOBA or sort of a slight MOBA adjacent game, for example, you better really understand the MOBA business, for example, and like be in those communities, understand what drives people, what they care about, and ideally not just as a player, but having seen it from the side of building those kind of games and understanding the analytics and metrics that really matter. That's just one example, but you could kind of swap in MOBA for like any genre that you could imagine. So I think sometimes teams chase a particular audience because they heard that audience was great to go after and lucrative for whatever reason, or really big. And it's not the end of the world if that's true, if they have an earnest intention really to understand that audience as good as anybody in the business. But if that's the case, you have to give that team a lot more runway, because they're going to make a lot of mistakes. But the craft is where sort of games happen. The craft means iterating, learning, getting feedback, improving it, polishing the hell out of things as you go through it. So team audience understanding, I'd say, is number one. And the second is you really do need to kind of have some sense of the kind of business model you imagine for the game from the very outset, because game designs, game systems, and even how you're going to identify the right kind of audience for your game does really depend on the business model selection. And there's no right or wrong decision, by the way, either. Like I think we saw a lot of free-to-play failures over the last decade, where the team looked at the fact that half the money was coming from mobile, therefore let's build a mobile game, and they didn't really understand free-to-play, and then their heart of hearts, they didn't want to build a free-to-play game. We saw a lot of situations where people didn't want to fully embrace the model. They would half-heartedly sort of give it lip service, but really they were building almost a premium game, but with a veneer of free-to-play. And those games really just didn't work out as growth models for these companies, and probably put a lot of people out of business. And I think I've seen the same thing with Web3 too, right? Like, so there's so many people who, particularly a couple, like 2 to 3 years ago, they saw so much capital being out there, lots of people trading tokens and buying NFTs, and they saw it as, okay, let's build a game for this. But they usually lacked one of the two things we've talked about. They were either a team that understood, say, NFTs really well, but they're figuring out how to build a game for the first time. And we've seen what happened. Like most of those couldn't actually ship a game. Or they were people that were great game designers, but they were paying lip service to the business model of Web3 because they heard people would cut them giant checks. But now I think the silver lining is it seems like those two categories have largely just been economically driven out of the market at this point. So the people who are still around at this point trying to build a Web3 game at this point in the industry, they've kind of endured through a lot of getting beaten up now over the last couple of years. And I'm seeing really super qualified teams that have worked on AAA games, that have worked on very successful free-to-play games, where they're now trying to figure out what are the economics, how does the game, but also more importantly, how does the game design change as a consequence of it? Because you build up these systems from not just a game idea, but the business model that goes along with that idea. So, I think we're still in discovery mode of which game designs best leverage the idea of an open economy or an ownership economy. But one thing I've always learned is that when, so I mentioned earlier, like the red flag, which is if a team does not earnestly embrace the business model that they purport to be going after. On the flip side of that, game designers are, I've been very lucky to work with some really great game designers in my life. These are the most creative people that are out there that I've ever had just the luck of being able to work with. So when they know the business model, they understand the constraints, and they understand the opportunities within that model, game designers who earnestly embrace it can build really, really compelling products with things that are different that you haven't seen before. And I think we are probably going to see the first couple of cases of that this year, even maybe in like closed beta versions of games this year. And certainly by next year. It just takes a long time to build great games, particularly.
While we're on the topic of attention economies and user funnels, it's obvious that great game design is at the heart of this whole topic, right? But I'm curious, when it comes to like live service games, an example that pops to mind would be like No Man's Sky, which had a fairly poor launch, but then the key, like just over passionate persistence, the team was able to like deliver some great updates down the line through various different DLCs, which I believe were all for free. And now the game has like maintained a really passionate core community. Whereas on the other side, like Overwatch 2, for example, is, I would say, objectively good in terms of the like what the core game is, but then through a number of various other reasons, has kind of like, I don't know, is bordering on a failed live service title. I'm curious to hear your take on how, outside of great game design, what are some of the other like tools that teams can use to kind of help with that long tail process post launch?
Live services doesn't begin when you ship your game. It begins while you're building your game. And that's because at the earliest points of the game, you should be bringing in people to play it. I wouldn't call this a red flag, but it's like a yellow flag I would start worrying about. Like, a lot of teams are very, very precious with their game. Like, they don't want anyone to see it until it's super polished. And I get it, because I understand shipping a game, and you don't want to ship a game until it's as polished as you can possibly make it with the runway that you can afford. But the craft of game making requires constant iteration, and your team will have very valuable insights into it. So I'm not taking away from like the intuition that your team brings to a particular audience in a particular genre. They're super valuable too. But you always have all these blind spots, having built it, and you've seen how things have changed, and you've added layers on layers, and the difficulty level is never tuned, for example, for the normal audience because it's become sort of ingrained in your own brain how to play the game at a high level relative to like the first time player experience. Like if you're not getting real authentic player feedback into the process early on, you're really depriving yourself of the inputs you need to work the craft of game making. And that can just start with just having a community, having a dialogue with your community. That could be a Discord channel, and actually attending to them and communicating and kind of building in public to whatever degree is appropriate for your game. But then instrumenting the game itself, having analytics in there, understanding the funnel, like where are people playing it through, where are they dropping off, adding, if you're a free-to-play game, add reasons to want to monetize early in the game process, so you actually start collecting some baseline data of whether even the closed beta audience would do that. If you're a Web3 game, it might be similar, except it's more of an ownership mentality. So at what points do people feel compelled to own something in the game, not because of ownership of itself or a speculative instinct, but because there's something awesome that you can now suddenly unlock and do in the game through that? These are things you want to start familiarizing yourself really as soon as the game is playable at any level. And maybe it's not the 1,000-person closed beta audience. Maybe it's the 20 friends of yours who are in the alpha early on. But I just think it's iteration, it's shots on goal, it's team velocity and your ability to take the data and the learnings from your audience and then rapidly incorporate that feedback into your game. With No Man's Sky is an interesting one. Like I think I love that team because of just how earnest they were about continuing to develop that game and make it work after what everyone would agree was kind of a rocky launch, and like the vision was so vast for that game, and what they delivered just wasn't quite there in terms of vision, but they caught up with a lot of the vision over time. So with a live services game, you sometimes have the opportunity to do that. I do want to caution the audience that's listening, though. Like, if you get to do that, you're really lucky. Like, I don't know what the financials and the runway and what the whole situation was with that team, but the fact that they got the opportunity to keep investing in the game after sort of the initial reviews came in, like, that's really special. You usually don't get that chance, especially in today's world, because No Man's Sky was quite a few years ago now, and the market has gotten more mature. People expect much more polished gameplay. If you pitch an amazing vision, then people are more likely to hold you to it now. They're not going to necessarily tolerate your rough beta in public launch for an extended period of time. If you had a closed beta where you have an audience that really loves it and you can communicate clearly about, like, hey, this is what our roadmap is for the game going forward as you're coming into it, and then you can start to actually execute against the roadmap and show people that there can be an expectation of more updates, more features, things that sort of address the whole vision of the game, not unlike what the No Man's Sky team did, then I think that could be a way to get through that. But if at all possible, the reality of games is, as much as you want to ship and you want to hit dates and you want to keep all those commitments you told to whatever promises you made around when you could get the game out, the worst thing you can do is ship a game before it's ready or like way before it's ready, because the market will be absolutely punishing on you.
Are there any standout like new developments within the live ops environment that kind of catch your attention? Some that I pointed out earlier would be like financial incentives or like user generated UGC tools.
Yeah, you mentioned UGC earlier. Yeah, I think I'm super excited about UGC generally. Like, I think some games will be like a Minecraft where the sort of inherent gameplay is almost pure sandbox. It's not, Minecraft isn't really pure sandbox because you can play with like kill the Ender Dragon kind of mode, but what has then built around Minecraft through all the servers and all the mods and the things you can play on Minecraft, despite the fact that it's actually not a very easy game to mod. So it's succeeded a lot in spite of itself, just because they opened it up and enough people wanted to do it. I mean, that tradition goes all the way back to Doom. So that's been there for a while, but now we have sort of these both platforms that are enabling UGC inherently as part of the game. I think that stuff is super interesting. I also just think it's really interesting to build games that are easier to mod, so you don't have to be like a JavaScript programmer, like stuff with better map editors, better connections into systems, and if appropriate for your game, even like business models or revenue share for people to, want to actually invest in making really great content and be able to participate in some of the economic upside of having done so. So I'm excited about that. In general, you could also say that one of the key aspects of building a live services game comes down to content. And one of the things that I learned at my studio, Disruptor Beam, when we started with our first game, which was Game of Thrones Ascent, which that was an amazing experience that we could talk about for a long time, working with George R. R. Martin and HBO. But like, we were releasing game content every week as the show released episodes. So episode would come out. Within 24 hours of the new episode, you would see characters and items, storyline progression, stuff immediately relevant to what you had just seen watching the show. They were kind of participating in this living world where you watch the show and then you'd be playing the game, and it was like the show was unfolding around you. So how do you do that? It's not easy, is the short answer. At least was not easy then. It's gotten a little bit easier now. But it comes down to having an authoring pipeline that can actually produce content rapidly and that has realistic goals about the kind of content that you're shipping. So fast forward to today, there's more ways to do that. We've got things like generative AI that could even be incorporated into your process. But even without sort of these science fiction scenarios of Gen AI and 3D graphics, which isn't quite all the way there yet, like just having the authoring pipeline in place that lets you create the content and the graphics, including 3D, on your individual developer workstations, test the complete game on your machine. This is a whole big problem with live ops games. Like, you've got all these servers and all these systems and all these brittle scripts and all these things that have to like talk to each other, and then just making it possible for a game developer to like get builds onto their machine for the thing they're working on can be super, super hard. That's a reason why people use Beamable, is like we integrated that whole process together. So we make it everything from building on your machine with a shared language, top to bottom, client and server, through making content, and then ultimately just you can push a button, ship it off to live and over the wire updates to your players playing the game. So it's hard to do, but if you do it, which we figured out how to do, the payoff is enormous, because now you're effectively increasing the velocity of content for your players, which means the frequency with which they're going to re-engage has gone up. If your business model depends on new updates and new items to sell to people, then you're increasing those touch points. We talked about attention at the very beginning of this. The frequency of potential conversion points will increase proportionate to the engagement time. The engagement time will increase according to how much you give that player to do, whether it's more content or lengthening the loops or adding more replayability to the game loops that are present.
So you've talked about like product-led development. You've talked about getting the game in the hands of your users and then quickly kind of increasing that velocity of iteration. I'm curious, what's your opinion on the Midnight Society kind of snapshot sort of development approach?
So with the second game that we built at Disruptor Beam, which was Star Trek Timelines, again, got to work with an amazing IP. we really wanted to build an authentic game for the Star Trek audience. So we had a pretty curated audience for that. But something special that we did is we actually had a pretty early build of the game. It was definitely not ready to be like an open beta kind of situation, but we had kind of very tight gameplay that we were able to bring to Penny Arcade Expo. And we had a big expo booth, and we set up a thing where we weren't really demoing the game. We were cultivating the community, and we were using their play on all these iPads that we set up in our booth to collect data on how people were engaging with the game. So we're basically doing early funnel analytics on engagement in the game, like the first day of Penny Arcade Expo. We had our development team sort of all wired in and ready to go. And we had some ideas about things we wanted to try. And the second day of Penny Arcade Expo, we basically, quote unquote, shipped a different version that tweaked some of the things based on some of the feedback we were served day one, sort of tweaking flow through the initial user experience and a little bit of gameplay. And we used the funnel data from both of those play experiences from the users to make some really important decisions. There's literally no excuse for not instrumenting the hell out of any game now. You can do it with our platform. You can do it with a bunch of things that are out there, and just start to get acquainted with more of a product management mindset where you're looking at the key metrics for the game and how people are getting through it. And definitely I'm going to be the advocate of get exposure to that as early as you can, as early as you can. I mean, and Star Trek, by the way, I mentioned sort of like that was deep into Star Trek. We had like 5 different game concepts for our Star Trek game. The first 4 weren't that great. And sometimes we knew it internally. Sometimes we kind of had to have players show us that it wasn't that great. It was on the 5th formulation of the game that we felt like we really connected between our aspiration of the authentic Star Trek gameplay that we wanted to deliver with really the right kind of core loop that would engage the audience. And only then did we start really heavily investing in the build out of the game. We really had to give ourselves that runway to play with the ideas. But going back to what I said earlier, it always does come back to that audience insight and understanding what people really care about. And if you can see that your audience that you aspire to delight, it really starts clicking with them. And you've got some amount of evidence that that audience will also scale up to be big enough to kind of create a business to keep everybody at that studio, you know, not just working, but investing in towards like the next titles and the things that you want to do as well. Then I think you've unlocked the magic.
And that just about brings us to the end. Thanks, John. It's been great chatting. Everything we've covered a ton of topics like attention economies, how content is the key for live ops, building tight feedback loops, and the benefits of like testing early on with like an ideal player cohort. So I want to thank you for your time, and we would love to have you on at another point in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to. This has been a blast. As you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. Yeah, there's so much more we could cover. People should check out my blog, my Substack as well, and they can hear about some of the things we didn't talk about, like web-based games and the way that might come back. So yeah, but happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, 100%. Go check out John's. What's the name? Where can people find it?
They can just go to metavert.io, which is my main website, and then click on the Substack there. But I think it's like meditations.metavert.io if you want to go direct into the blog.
Well, yeah. And with that, yeah, thanks. See ya. The content of this video is intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. The views shared by Alex and I are our own, and we may hold investments in some of the companies or digital assets featured in the video.